regime. But the American people are tired of regime change wars that cost us billions of dollars and risk our lives.
The 37-hour strike on Iran's nuclear facilities in June, dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer, totaled $2.25 billion. This time, President Trump says the war could last 4 to 5 weeks. If so, costs are likely to range into the hundreds of billions. There is the cost of munitions. The bunker busters dropped on Iran's nuclear sites cost $10 million to $20 million apiece. For the sites targeted by Iranian bombs at American bases throughout the Middle East alone, rebuilding will cost millions, possibly billions. Those direct costs are all paid by American taxpayers, but as consumers, Americans and others will pay more in higher oil costs and in sinking stock values. The U.S. spends nearly $1 trillion on its military, more than any other country in the world, more than the next 9 countries combined, in fact. That's 3 times more than China, nearly 7 times more than Russia. And since 2001, the U.S. has spent an estimated $5.8 trillion funding more than 2 decades of war in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And with the war in Iran, that tally is on the rise. How long the war lasts could be determined in part by how long Americans are willing to bear the financial and human toll of war. John Hendren, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Okay, it's just gone 3:30 GMT. Let's bring you up to date on all the latest developments. Israeli strikes in Tehran are ongoing at this hour. Iran's state broadcaster has reported 2 new explosions near its Tehran headquarters about an hour or so ago. Iranian Red Crescent reports more than 500 people have now been killed across the country since strikes began on Saturday. Okay, let's go to Towed Asadi, who's live for us in Tehran. So, Towed, a lot to discuss, but I want to start first with the latest strikes, including the strikes on Iran's state broadcaster. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I can say that starting from midnight, we witnessed a round of new Israeli and American strikes targeting different places across the country, and including here in the capital. We've got several reports, first and foremost related to the complex belonging to the IRIB, the state TV, which was targeted. The thick smoke was seen to be coming out of the scene, and also that was not limited to that, even though on that single case we don't have updates about casualties, but we know that there are risks of actually growing numbers of fatalities when it comes to civilians. And of course, we had other reports about the buildings belonging to the Council of Expediency, which was targeted in an overnight strike by the Americans or Israeli strikes. This is what we have so far, but still the truth of the matter is that in a broader context, we know that it's not limited to Tehran. Across other cities in the country, we have reports of the strikes, as well as the interception of drones from IRGC. And on that also, we know that IRGC last night came out with a statement to say that Iran's retaliatory actions are going to be continued in what they called 13th wave of strikes. They said that they have targeted an American base in the Kuwait and also a gathering of U.S. forces in Dubai.
And the fact that strikes from the U.S. and Israel have gone beyond military targets, you mentioned strategic infrastructure, schools have been hit, hospitals. How is that being hospitals? How is that being perceived inside Iran? What are ordinary Iranians saying? Is there fear, anger, or support for the government?
Well, actually, it's a sort of, I can say, mixture of different sentiments that we can see. In the evening yesterday, we saw people joining demonstrations in support to the government and to show their solidarity and to express their sort of protest against these strikes. And also, We have to keep in mind that in the Iranian context, socially speaking, we're dealing with a sort of polarized society. Back in December, we saw a protest taking place, first of all, coming from the economic hardships that people were facing, seeing the deteriorated economy of the country. Later, it came that there are also political and social demands that are creating a sort of public dissatisfaction among the Iranians. So whether we are dealing with the pro-state or anti-state people, or even when it comes to the gray zone in the society, in all these three camps, what is common is actually this sense of uncertainty, this sense of fear and frustration as the country continues to face these strikes, and as the very fundamental issues such as the sovereignty of the country, such as the security of the country is under a serious risk, and people are closely following the developments to see how future could unfurl.
Okay, for now, thank you, Tawed Asadi. Okay, for now, thank you, Tawed Asadi, our correspondent there in Tehran. Now, Israeli strikes have killed at least 52 people in Lebanon since Saturday. The attacks were responding to a barrage of missiles launched by Hezbollah, who had fired into Israel in solidarity with Iran. Heidi Pett sent us this report from Beirut.
Lebanon is paying the price of an expanding war with Iran. Israeli strikes hitting the country again and again. Israel says the strikes are in response to rockets launched by Hezbollah. Rockets sent in response to the assassination of Iran's supreme leader. Dozens of people have been killed, and the death toll is rising. Israel says it targeted more than 70 Hezbollah facilities, including weapons storage sites. The smoke hanging above Beirut showing the scale of the carnage. Thousands are now fleeing southern Lebanon, bumper to bumper, with nowhere to go.
We are originally from Ait al-Shab. We left at 3 a.m. We still don't know where we're going.
We want to live in stability, to continue our lives. We have children. We want to live. This is our goal, honestly.
Hezbollah's attacks have received no support from Lebanon's government, which on Monday banned all military activities by the Tehran-backed group.
The Lebanese state declares its absolute rejection, leaving no room for ambiguity or interpretation of any military or security actions launched from the Lebanese territory outside the framework of its legitimate institutions. It affirms that the decision of war and peace is exclusively in its hands, which necessitates the immediate prohibition of all Hezbollah's security and military activities as being outside the law, and obliging it to hand over its weapons to the Lebanese state.
But as night fell, the Israeli strikes targeting Hezbollah sites kept coming. A ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon was signed in late 2024, but it has been breached almost daily. Monday's missile and rocket strikes were a major escalation in a widening conflict with Iran. Heidi Pett, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
Now, congressional leaders in Washington have been briefed by the U.S. Secretary of State and the CIA director on why the Trump administration launched strikes on Iran. Patty Culhane has more from Capitol Hill.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio came here to the Hill to brief the so-called Gang of Eight. Those are the most senior leaders on the National Security Committees, the leadership. He was a bit combative talking to reporters on his way into the meeting. He described exactly the justification for why now. And this was a bit of a new one. He said Israel was going to hit Iran. We believed then that Iran would hit the U.S., so we had to hit to make sure there weren't more American casualties. He left out the part that America has some influence over Israel. If it didn't want it to strike Iran, it probably could have tried to make that happen. But he did also describe the goals. He said it is to get rid of the missile program. It is to get rid of the Iranian Navy so that they can't interfere with shipping. And as for exactly why now, and this again was new, he said that they believe that in a year to a year and a half, Iran would have crossed what he called the line of immunity. Basically, that they would have had so many missiles and so many drones that no one could have targeted them for their nuclear program, and he issued a bit of a dire warning.
The objectives of this operation are to destroy their ballistic missile capability and make sure they can't rebuild it, and make sure that they can't hide behind that to have a nuclear program. That's the objective of the mission. That said, abundantly clear, we would love for there to be an Iran that's not governed by radical Shia clerics, as I've said myself repeatedly for years. I'm not going to give away the details of our tactical efforts, but the hardest hits are yet to come from the U.S. military. The next phase will be even more punishing on Iran than it is right now.
Now, we expect all of the senior leaders from the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA director, they're going to be on Capitol Hill on Tuesday, and they are expected to brief all of the members of the House and the Senate behind closed doors. The backdrop for all of this is this week, we expect the Congress to vote on a War Powers Resolution Act, which would basically say the U.S. military action in Iran has to stop without congressional approval. That said, even if it does pass, it likely won't pass by the numbers that could override an expected presidential veto. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera on Capitol Hill.
Well, U.S. President Trump on Monday again warned Americans without any evidence that Iran was building a missile that could soon reach the United States. That's why he intends to continue attacking Iran for as long as it takes to ensure Iran never builds a nuclear weapon. Al Jazeera's White House correspondent Kimmy Halkett reports now.
Speaking for the first time from the White House since launching military strikes against Iran, U.S. President Donald Trump explained why he deployed U.S. forces.
This was our last best chance to strike.
At a medal ceremony honoring American soldiers, Trump laid out his objectives for the mission, dubbed Operation Epic Fury.
We're destroying Iran's missile capabilities. Second, we're annihilating their neighbor. We've knocked out already 10 ships. They're at the bottom of the sea. Third, we're ensuring that the world's #1 sponsor of terror can never obtain a nuclear weapon. And finally, we're ensuring that the Iranian regime cannot continue to arm, fund, and direct terrorist armies outside of their borders.
Following U.S. strikes on Iran in June of 2025, Trump says Iran defied warnings to halt pursuing a nuclear weapon and was using its conventional ballistic missile program to shield nuclear ambitions. Trump also explained why he gave up on diplomacy.
We thought we had a deal, but then they backed out. And they came back, and we thought we had a deal, and they backed out. I said, you can't deal with these people.
Well, good morning.
Hours earlier, the defense secretary acknowledged there have been U.S. casualties. He explained how Iran broke through U.S. defenses, killing 4 soldiers.
Every once in a while, you might have one, unfortunately, we call it a squirter that makes its way through. And in that particular case, it happened to hit a tactical operations center.
And the chair of the Joint Chiefs cautioned there could be more deaths.
This is not a single overnight operation. The military objectives that CENTCOM and the Joint Force have been tasked with will take some time to achieve, and in some cases will be difficult and gritty work. We expect to take additional losses.
President Trump insists combat operations are ahead of schedule. Still, he's not ruling out sending U.S. troops into Iran. He's also cautioned Americans that combat operations could last more than a month. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, the White House.
Let's get more with our diplomatic editor, James Bays, who joins us now live in the studio, James. So the narrative coming from the Trump administration appears to have changed a little bit. It seems to be less about, oh, Iran is a nuclear threat, and more that the U.S. Struck Iran preemptively because it knew that Israel was about to act anyway or attack Iran anyway. How is that likely to be received internationally?
Well, they're not keeping their story straight, and that is a problem because they needed to make a case for something as big as this to the world, American people. And I think the latter, the American people, in some ways is going to be the bigger problem because the rest of the world is not getting a say in this. Even the closest allies of the US were not involved in any way in the planning of any of this or were brought into any of the details of this. In fact, the only ally that's been involved in this operation is Israel. If you go back to look at precedents for this sort of thing, you have to go back to 1990, 1991 and 2003, the two occasions where the US attacked Iraq, the latter of those, the invasion of Iraq. And there were lots and lots of question marks about all of that and the legality of that. But there was a real effort made at the time to make the case to the American people and people around the world. The first time in 1990, they managed to get a Security Council resolution and 42 nations on side. The second time, they did much more controversial. They didn't get that Security Council resolution, but they did spend the best part of a year trying to make the case. And it was a very consistent case, even if most people now think it was the evidence was wrong and the case was wrong, because, of course, there were no weapons of mass destruction. In this case, there isn't really a case. We don't really properly have an explanation why President Trump started the war, and we don't yet know what the reasons would be for him to end the war. What should Iran do? What should happen on the ground to end the war? That, as well, is not clear at this stage.
James, it's allies in the Gulf that are bearing the brunt of this right now. What is it that the Gulf countries can do from a diplomatic point of view to reduce the escalation at this point?
Well, I think oddly, they're getting very upset with Iran. They had good diplomatic relations with Iran and had urged diplomacy before this. But actually, on this one point, I think the nations in this region and Iran are hoping the same thing might happen, which is that the economic effects of this are going to bring the rest of the world in to bring some leverage on President Trump to stop the continuation of this war, because of the effects it's going to have on the oil price, on the gas price, on the financial markets around the world, potentially inflation rising again. As I said, I think those...
And sorry, James, to interrupt, but on that point, we are already hearing that Donald Trump is expected to meet with the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary of Energy later this Tuesday. So clearly, there are voices in his ear saying, this is a problem now.
Yes, it is a problem, I think, because the economy, when it comes to US elections, is issue number one, and there's a very big US election, the midterms coming up in November. If he loses the House then, in that election, then he really does not have the power to do many of the things he would want to do. Some have said that with all the problems Donald Trump is facing, that this going to war with Iran is a distraction. But you look at the polls, and this in itself, ahead of the military action, was not a popular thing to do.
James, it seems like a long time ago, but it was only a few days ago that we were having these indirect talks between the US and Iran in Oman about Iran's nuclear capabilities. What diplomatic channels are available now in terms of de-escalating this conflict?
Well, I think Iran is making the case that it's been twice burnt, that it was doing diplomatic talks this time around in Geneva.
And that's a fair point, isn't it?
Yes, the talks were supposed to be taking place again on Monday, and of course the war started on Saturday. And that's exactly what happened last time in June. They had more talks set, and a war started that time by Israel with the US joining in. I don't think Iran wants an end to diplomacy. It doesn't want negotiations with the US right now, but what it would like, I think, is the economic problems, and it seems that they are targeting economic targets here in the Gulf, infrastructure, also now closing the Straits of Hormuz. They're hoping that that's the leverage that will force diplomacy, force other key players. China, I think, is very important, but also Europe, to put pressure on the United States. But really, it's only really one man who will determine when this war ends. We don't know what his objectives are, but it's President Trump who will decide when this is over and when he will, as almost certainly knowing President Trump, when he will declare victory, whatever the outcome.
It's good you mentioned China on the energy front, because obviously they will be affected by the oil situation. But we haven't heard very much from other global powers, especially Russia, for example. What are they thinking here as this crisis evolves and continues?
But the Russians particularly, or all of them, the Russians particularly, I think, probably think this is rather a good distraction from what's been going on with the pressure of all of the world on them, and particularly the European powers on them. The focus is off. They can, President Putin can focus on the war against Ukraine without the Europeans able to say very much at the moment. Because remember, the main case the Europeans make is that you breached international law, you invaded another country, you launched a war that you chose to launch when it wasn't justified by international law and a Security Council resolution. Well, you can make exactly the same case against the United States and Donald Trump, given what's just happened.
Many thanks for that. Diplomatic editor James Bays in the studio. Thank you. Have a good sleep. Now, the conflict with Iran and concerns about energy supplies have shaken global markets. As we explained, the sell-off in Asia is continuing for a second day. Tuesday's opening in Seoul was the first trading session there since the strikes began. South Korea's benchmark started sharply down. Let's go to Katrina Yu, who is in Beijing, with the latest updates. So markets have now opened in Asia. Katrina, what is the latest you can tell us?
That's right, they've opened and they've actually just closed for the morning session, and all signs point to investors continuing to be extremely worried about this conflict, especially since there is no end in sight, especially in the short term. Now, the markets are down in Asia. Leading the fall are stocks around energy, aviation, shipping. All of these stocks are leading declines when it comes to different financial markets. In South Korea, that fell by the most, ending the morning session down about 5%. In Japan, we're looking at a fall of about 2.3%. Interestingly, the markets in China are fairly even. When they opened on Monday, they were down about 2%, but now we're seeing they're down just under 0.5%. And I think there are a few reasons looking at this. Now, it is true that China is very exposed, or is exposed by this conflict. 50% of its imported oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. Powdered oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. Powdered oil comes through the Strait of Hormuz. However, China also has large amounts of strategic reserves when it comes to oil. We don't know exactly how many, but there are reports that China has been stockpiling its crude oil, particularly from Iran, and that they may have at least 3 months' worth of oil from Iran. So that gives it a bit of cushion for many of the major impacts from this disruption. Beijing has also been trying to diversify its sources of oil, and it will continue to do so, possibly from Russia, from Central Asia, even from Brazil. So I think that's why we have the Chinese markets looking quite stable. And also, I think when you look at the overall pie, the overall picture of where China gets all its energy from, we also have other sources such as renewable energy. So even though this conflict is having a big effect on China's oil or its energy proportion, it is still less than 10%. So right now, China seems to be not panicking so far.
Okay, thank you for that. Katrina Yu there for us with the very latest from Beijing. Now, an emergency meeting has been held at the International Atomic Energy Agency, which follows concerns over US and Israeli actions towards Iran in recent days. The IAEA says nuclear facilities haven't been targeted in the same way they were last June. Brad Smith has more from Vienna.
So Russia and Iran called for this emergency meeting of the IAEA because they want its board to address what they call the unprovoked acts of armed aggression by Israel and the US on Iran.
It is for the second time that they invade our countries during negotiations. Today, we are supposed to hold technical meetings here in Vienna. Based on such deceptions and unfounded allegations, they targeted or peaceful safeguarded nuclear facilities.
The Iranians